The bank took his workshop on a Tuesday morning in early October, and by Thursday the men who had once tipped their hats to him on the boardwalk of Sable Creek crossed the street rather than meet his eyes. His name was Eli Bishop, and the man who ruined him was named Horace Vandermeer, a banker with soft hands and a colder heart, who had smiled at Eli across a desk while signing away everything Eli's father had built. When the dust settled, Eli Bishop had $11 in his pocket, a mule named Judas, and nothing else in the whole of Colorado Territory that he could call his own. It was with those $11 that he walked into the county courthouse on a gray November afternoon and bought, for the sum of $9, a crumbling stone chapel that the town of Sable Creek had abandoned years before, a building so forgotten that the auctioneer nearly forgot to call its number. Folks in town shook their heads and said it was the saddest purchase a broken man had ever made. But sealed behind the old stone altar of that forgotten chapel lay something that no one in Sable Creek, least of all Eli Bishop, could have imagined, a secret that would not only restore one ruined man's fortune, but would return to an entire mining town the one thing it had believed lost forever. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Eli Bishop. If you find comfort in stories of quiet men who rebuild what the world tore down, we invite you to stay with us a while, for this is one of those stories. Eli Bishop had been raised with stone dust in his lungs and sawdust under his fingernails, the son of a master mason named Thomas Bishop who had come west from Pennsylvania in 1858 with nothing but a set of chisels wrapped in oilcloth and a conviction that a man's worth could be measured in the straightness of his walls. Thomas Bishop built half of what still stood in the early days of the Colorado gold camps, the assay office in Central City, the schoolhouse in Blackhawk, the stone footings beneath churches whose wooden steeples had long since burned and been rebuilt twice over. He raised his son not with sermons but with his hands, teaching him that a joint cut true would outlast the man who cut it, and that there was no shame in labor done honestly, only in labor done carelessly. Eli grew up believing this the way other boys believed in Scripture, and by the time he was 20 he could set a keystone with the same patient certainty his father had, could read the grain of a stone the way a rancher reads weather, could tell within an inch how deep a foundation needed to run before frost heaved it apart. His mother, Ruth Bishop, had been a quieter kind of teacher. She kept the ledgers for his father's small masonry business, and she taught Eli that a man's word, once given, was a debt as real as any owed in coin, and that the two, word and coin, were not so different after all, both worth nothing the moment a man broke faith with them. She died of a fever when Eli was 17, and Thomas Bishop followed her into the ground 11 years later, leaving Eli the tools, the small stone workshop on the edge of Sable Creek, and a modest list of unfinished contracts that Eli finished one by one with the same slow care his father would have shown. By the time Eli was 34, married briefly and widowed early, his wife Sarah taken by the same influenza that swept through the mining camps in the hard winter of 1876, he had built, quietly and without fanfare, a reputation as the finest stonemason between Sable Creek and Georgetown. Men brought him foundations for banks and courthouses. He turned none of them away, and he never once, in 15 years of work, allowed a wall of his to crack before its time. It was this reputation, ironically, that drew Horace Vandermeer to him in the spring of 1880. Vandermeer had come to Sable Creek 2 years prior with capital from back east and a plan to expand the town's modest silver operations into something grander, a stamp mill, a new bank building, rows of company housing for the miners who would work the deeper veins his surveys had located. He needed a mason he could trust with the foundation of his new bank, a building meant to stand as the literal and figurative bedrock of his ambitions, and every man in town pointed him toward Eli Bishop. Vandermeer offered Eli a contract larger than any he had taken before, payment in installments tied to the completion of each phase, and Eli, flattered and hopeful of finally expanding beyond his father's modest legacy, signed it without the caution his mother would have counseled. There had been a season, in the years just after his father's death, when Eli had considered leaving the trade altogether, unmoored as he felt without the old man's steady presence beside him at the cutting bench, and it was only the memory of his mother's ledgers, and the strange comfort he found in tracing his father's chalk marks still faintly visible on the workshop's oldest tools, that had kept him at the work. He had thrown himself instead into perfecting it, studying old pattern books late into the night, walking for miles some Sundays simply to examine the stonework of buildings other masons had raised, so that by the time Vandermeer came calling, Eli Bishop was not merely his father's son but a craftsman in his own right, hungry, perhaps too hungry, for the chance to prove it on a scale his father had never attempted. He hired 2 extra men, a young apprentice named Gideon Marsh and an older stonecutter named Pruitt Coyle who had worked seasons with his father years before. He bought stone on credit from the quarry in Idaho Springs, borrowing against the promised payments. He worked through the summer and into the fall, laying a foundation so true that visiting engineers from Denver came to admire it, and when the walls rose above it, plumb and solid, Eli Bishop believed, for the first time since his father's death, that he had built something that would outlast him in more than stone alone. He had not counted on the nature of the man he had trusted. Horace Vandermeer's fortune, it would later be whispered though never proven in any court a poor man could afford, was built as much on delay and default as on silver. He paid the first installment on time, the second late, and by the time the building was finished, he informed Eli, with an expression of genuine seeming regret, that a downturn in silver prices back east had left him unable to complete the contract as written, and that he would instead be settling accounts through the bank's foreclosure process, seizing the workshop and tools Eli had put up as collateral against his own credit at the quarry, credit which, it emerged, Vandermeer's own bank now held, having quietly purchased the note from the Idaho Springs merchant weeks before. It was, Eli would understand only much later, no accident at all, but a design as carefully laid as any foundation, a wealthy man using the machinery of debt to strip a poorer one of everything he had built, and to acquire, in the process, both a finished bank and the tools and reputation of the finest mason in the county, all for the price of a broken promise. The foreclosure notice came in September. By October the workshop doors were nailed shut with a county seal, and the tools that had passed from Thomas Bishop's hands to Eli's were catalogued as bank property, to be auctioned to cover the remaining debt. Eli did not fight it in the courts, for he had no money for lawyers and no faith that Sable Creek's single judge, a man who dined regularly at Vandermeer's table, would rule against the town's most prominent citizen. He simply watched, in the gray light of an early frost, as the life his father had built for him was itemized and sealed, and he walked away from it with $11 in his pocket, the 2 men he had hired paid off with the last of his savings, and Judas the mule, who had at least never once broken a promise to him. Gideon Marsh, the young apprentice, wept openly the day the seal went up on the workshop door, and old Pruitt Coyle, who had known Thomas Bishop and had hoped to see the son carry the name as far as the father had, simply gripped Eli's shoulder once, hard, and said nothing at all, for there was nothing a man of his generation believed needed saying about a debt gone bad. What stung Eli most in those weeks was not the loss of the tools themselves, replaceable in time by a patient man, but the quiet way his neighbors began to speak of him afterward, in the careful, pitying tones reserved for men who had been foolish rather than merely unfortunate, as though trusting a contract signed in good faith were itself a kind of failing. He heard, more than once, second-hand through the thin walls of the boarding houses and saloons, that Vandermeer told his own version of the affair at dinner parties, a version in which he himself appeared the reluctant, regretful creditor forced by circumstance to act, rather than the architect of the very circumstance he claimed to regret. He might have left Sable Creek entirely, as most ruined men did, riding west toward some fresh start where no one knew his name or his failure. But something in him, some stubborn inheritance from his father's patient hands, refused to be driven out of the town his family had helped build. He took a room above the livery in exchange for mending its stone foundation, and he began, out of habit more than hope, to attend the county courthouse's monthly auctions of unclaimed and abandoned property, not because he had money to spend but because it gave him something to do with the long, aching hours of a man who no longer had work to fill them. It was at one such auction, on a raw November afternoon with the wind cutting down off the peaks and rattling the courthouse windows, that the auctioneer, a tired man named Grissom who wanted to be home before the weather turned, called out almost as an afterthought the final item of the day, a stone chapel on the northern edge of town, built during the boom years of the late 1860s by the mining company that had since moved its operations to richer ground 20 miles east, taking with it the congregation and the town's early prosperity both. The chapel had stood empty for nearly a decade, its roof sagging, its windows broken by boys with slingshots, its stone walls Eli recognized even from across the room, for his own father had helped lay them, slowly succumbing to the frost heave that untended foundations always suffered. No one in the room raised a hand. Grissom called for bids twice, received silence twice, and was preparing to strike his gavel and declare the lot forfeit to the county when Eli Bishop, almost without deciding to, raised his hand and offered $9. There was a ripple of quiet laughter in the room, not unkind exactly, but the laughter of men who believed they were watching a broken man make one more foolish decision to complete his ruin. $9 for a roofless chapel that would cost 50 times that to repair, a building no one wanted, on land no one wanted, in a corner of town the mining company itself had abandoned. Grissom looked at Eli for a long moment, as if giving him a chance to reconsider, then shrugged and brought down his gavel. The chapel, and the quarter-acre of frost-bitten ground beneath it, belonged to Eli Bishop for the price of a week's meager food. He walked out to see it the following morning, Judas plodding along behind him loaded with what few tools he had managed to keep from the bank's inventory, tools too worn or too specialized for Vandermeer's men to have bothered claiming. The chapel stood at the end of a rutted lane grown thick with sage, its bell tower missing its bell, its double doors hanging from a single hinge each, creaking in the wind like something trying to speak. Inside, the morning light fell through the broken roof in pale shafts, illuminating a floor thick with dust and dead leaves, a scattering of fallen roof beams, and at the far end, beneath the ruined window where a rose window of colored glass had once been, the stone altar his father had built with his own hands 20 years before. Eli spent that first day simply clearing debris, more out of the old habit of honest labor than any plan, for he had no notion yet of what he might do with a roofless chapel and no congregation to fill it. It was while clearing the fallen plaster and rotted timber from around the altar's base that his hand, running along the seam where altar met wall out of the mason's old instinct to check a joint's integrity, found something his eye had missed entirely, a line in the stone too straight, too deliberate, to be the work of settling or decay. It was a seam cut by a chisel, not by time, running along the back edge of the altar where it met the rear wall of the apse, disguised beneath a layer of whitewash gone gray with age. His father, Eli realized with a slow tightening in his chest, had built more into this altar than a place to rest a Bible and a candle. He had built a door. It took him the better part of 2 days, working carefully with a mason's patience so as not to damage whatever lay hidden, to work the seam free. The mechanism, when he finally understood it, was elegant in its simplicity, a counterweight stone block, no larger than a hearthstone, that pivoted inward when pressure was applied to a specific point along its lower edge, a point marked, he realized only after he'd found it, by a small cross carved so faintly into the stone that a casual eye would take it for a natural flaw. Behind the stone was a cavity perhaps 2 feet deep and lined with dry cedar planking, and within that cavity, wrapped in oilcloth that had kept out 2 decades of damp, Eli found a strongbox no larger than a bread loaf, and beside it, a leather satchel containing a bundle of papers tied with waxed cord. He did not open the strongbox that first evening, for the light was failing and something in him, some instinct passed down from his mother's careful ledgers, told him this was not a discovery to rush. He carried both the box and the satchel back to his room above the livery and sat with them through the night, turning them over in the lamplight, feeling the weight of the box and wondering, with a mason's practical mind, what a man might hide inside the altar of a chapel he himself had helped to build. The papers, when Eli finally untied them with careful fingers the next morning, told a story that reshaped everything he understood about the chapel, about his father, and about the town of Sable Creek itself. They were the private letters and account books of a man named Reverend Amos Whitfield, the chapel's founding minister, written in the years between 1867 and 1869, when Sable Creek had been not the modest, struggling town Eli knew but a booming silver camp of nearly 2,000 souls, its mine, the Whitfield claim, among the richest in the territory. Reverend Whitfield, it emerged from his careful, cramped hand, had been more than a preacher, he had been, before taking up the collar, a prospector himself, and it was his own claim, discovered in 1864 and worked quietly for 3 years before he sold the mining rights to the company that would later build the chapel he ministered in, that had first drawn fortune-seekers to the valley. Whitfield had used a portion of the proceeds from that sale, and from the tithes of his prospering congregation, to establish what his letters called the Founders' Fund, a store of silver and gold coin set aside, deliberately and secretly, to build a school, a hospital, and eventually a proper college for the children of the miners who would come after him, so that the town's prosperity might outlast the ore itself, as all mining towns' prosperity eventually did not. But Whitfield's letters grew darker as they progressed through 1868, describing his growing alarm at the ambitions of the mining company's chief agent, a man named Silas Pruitt, who had begun pressuring the Reverend to hand over administration of the Founders' Fund to the company itself, ostensibly to invest it in expanding operations, but who Whitfield suspected, and eventually confirmed through a sympathetic clerk, intended simply to seize the fund and funnel it east to enrich the companies. Absentee owners, leaving the town with nothing when the silver eventually ran thin, as Whitfield, with a prospector's practical understanding of ore veins, already suspected it would. Rather than surrender the fund, Whitfield had quietly converted it to coin, sealed it within the very altar he had commissioned Thomas Bishop, Eli's father, to build, for the two men, letters revealed, had become close friends, bound by a shared conviction that a town's wealth belonged to the people who dug it from the ground and not to the men who merely financed the digging, and had recorded, in a final letter dated just weeks before his death from pneumonia in the brutal winter of 1869. Precise instructions for how the fund should someday be recovered and used, should the town ever again have need of it, not for any one man's enrichment, but for a school, first and foremost, for I have watched too many children in this camp grow to manhood able to read nothing but the assay office's posted prices, and I will not have it said that Sable Creek valued silver above its own sons and daughters. The strongbox, when Eli finally worked its old lock free with a bent nail and a mason's patience, contained not the treasure a lesser man might have hoped for, no glittering pile of coin, but something almost more valuable in its particulars, a smaller sum of gold eagles, perhaps $300 worth, carefully preserved, along with a deed, registered, Eli would confirm days later at the courthouse with trembling hands, and never rescinded, to 40 acres of land on the eastern edge of the original town plat, land that Silas Pruitt's mining company, in its haste to relocate operations after Whitfield's death and the fund's mysterious disappearance, had apparently never thought to claim, believing perhaps that Whitfield had simply spent the fund before he died, or that it had been lost entirely to whoever plundered a dead man's effects. He read the letters twice through that first morning, and then a third time, more slowly, in the afternoon light, pausing over passages where Whitfield described the mining camp in its earliest days, the tent city that had sprung up along the creek almost overnight, the makeshift services he had held under a canvas awning before the congregation raised enough for a proper roof, and the particular joy he had taken, as a former prospector himself, in watching miners' children learn their letters by firelight from whatever scrap of newspaper could be found. There was a tenderness in Whitfield's hand that made Eli feel, oddly, as though he were being introduced to a man he had somehow always known, a man whose convictions ran so closely parallel to his own father's that the friendship between them, evident in every line, seemed almost inevitable in hindsight. Eli understood, sitting alone in his small room with the weight of Reverend Whitfield's careful hand across 2 decades of silence, that his father had known. Thomas Bishop had built that hidden door with the Reverend's blessing and had carried the secret to his own grave rather than betray a dying friend's trust, waiting perhaps for a day when the town, and the right man, might need it. Eli did not act quickly, though the gold alone would have solved his own ruin twice over. He carried the deed and the letters to the county recorder's office and confirmed, through 3 days of careful, quiet research that left the clerk more curious than he let on, that the 40 acres described in Whitfield's deed had indeed never been claimed by the mining company nor by any other party, that it sat, technically, still registered in the name of a defunct religious trust that Whitfield himself had established, and that as the chapel's current legal owner, having purchased the entire original church property at auction, Eli Bishop now held whatever rights remained to that trust and its unclaimed land. Word of Eli's discovery could not, of course, stay entirely private in a town as small as Sable Creek, and it reached Horace Vandermeer within the week, carried, Eli suspected though never confirmed, by the same county clerk who had processed his deed inquiry. Vandermeer arrived at the chapel on a cold afternoon in early December, dressed in his good wool coat, smiling the same smile he had worn across his desk the day he ruined Eli, and offered, with an air of magnanimous generosity, to purchase the chapel property back from Eli for $200, a sum that would have seemed a fortune to the man Eli had been in October, but which Eli now understood, having read Whitfield's careful accounting, represented perhaps 1/10 the true value of what the property actually held, both in recovered fund and in the 40 acres of unclaimed land that sat. Eli had also confirmed at the recorder's office, directly along the surveyed route of a new spur rail line the territorial government was said to be planning within 2 years' time, a fact Vandermeer's own bank had quietly begun positioning to profit from through land speculation elsewhere in the valley. Eli refused the offer, politely but without hesitation, and watched Vandermeer's smile tighten at the edges into something harder. The banker's tone shifted then, and he reminded Eli, with the same soft-spoken menace he had used before the foreclosure, that Sable Creek was a small town, that Eli's credit and reputation there depended a great deal on the goodwill of men like himself, and that a poor man who refused a generous offer from his bank might find that goodwill difficult to recover. He suggested, not quite as a threat but close enough that Eli heard it plainly, that the old religious trust's claim to the 40 acres might not survive close legal scrutiny, and that Vandermeer's own lawyers, well paid and well connected to the territorial judge, would be happy to test that claim in court, a fight Eli, penniless as he was, could not hope to win on the strength of law alone, whatever the strength of his claim in truth. In the days that followed, Eli felt the old familiar chill of isolation creeping back through Sable Creek, the same careful distance the town had kept from him after the foreclosure. 2 merchants who had quietly agreed to extend him credit for lumber and nails suddenly discovered reasons to delay, and Gideon Marsh, the young apprentice who had wept at the workshop door, came to him one evening with an awkward, apologetic look to say that his own father, who did business with Vandermeer's bank, had asked him to keep his distance from the chapel for a time. Eli did not blame any of them. He understood, better than most, the particular kind of fear a small bank could instill in a small town, where a man's credit was often the only thing standing between his family and a hard winter. It would have been easy, in those lonely evenings above the livery with the strongbox locked beneath his bed, to believe that Vandermeer's soft threats had already won, that the gold and the deed and the whole improbable story of Reverend Whitfield's hidden fund would end quietly, buried a second time by a banker's patient pressure rather than by 20 years of dust. But Eli found himself returning, again and again in those difficult nights, to a single line from Whitfield's final letter, written in a hand grown shaky with fever, that a fund hidden out of fear served no one, and that courage, however late it arrived, was still courage. It was in the days following Vandermeer's visit, with the banker's threat hanging over him and the temptation, however briefly it flickered, to simply take the gold and the strongbox and vanish west before Vandermeer's lawyers could act, that Eli remembered most clearly the values his parents had raised him with, his father's conviction that a wall built true would outlast the man who cut it, and his mother's insistence that a man's word was a debt as real as coin. Reverend Whitfield had asked, in his final letter, that the fund be used to build a school, not to enrich the one man fortunate enough to find it, and Eli understood, turning the matter over through several sleepless nights, that if he simply pocketed the recovered gold for his own use, he would become no better than Vandermeer himself, a man who had also, after all, told himself some private justification for taking what belonged to others. He made his decision on a morning in mid-December, walking not to the bank but to the small office of the Sable Creek Miner, the town's weekly newspaper, where he laid before its editor, a skeptical but fair-minded woman named Cora Danziger, the full record of Reverend Whitfield's letters, the deed to the 40 acres, and his own account of Vandermeer's visit and veiled threat. Cora Danziger, who had watched Vandermeer's bank foreclose on 3 other small businessmen in as many years and had long suspected, without proof, that the banker's fortune rested on foundations less solid than they appeared, published the full story on the front page of the following week's edition, under the headline that would be quoted in the county seat's larger paper within days, "The Founders Fund Found at Last. Reverend Whitfield's Lost Legacy to Build Sable Creek's First School." The town's reaction was immediate and, to Eli's quiet astonishment, entirely on his side. Old-timers who remembered Reverend Whitfield from the boom years came forward with their own stories of the beloved minister's generosity and his open contempt for Silas Pruitt's company, corroborating the letter's account and lending Eli's claim a weight no lawyer's argument could have matched. The recorder's office, facing public scrutiny it had not expected, confirmed formally and publicly that the religious trust's claim to the 40 acres was valid and unchallenged, and that any effort by Vandermeer's bank to contest it would require overturning 2 decades of unbroken legal record in open court, before a public now watching closely and a judge no longer quite so eager to be seen dining at the banker's table. Vandermeer, sensing the tide had turned against him and unwilling to risk the deeper scrutiny that a public court fight might bring to his own bank's dealings, quietly withdrew his interest in the property within the month, and though he never publicly apologized for the foreclosure that had ruined Eli in the first place, the whispered rumors of his methods, once spoken only behind closed doors, now moved openly through the town's boardwalks and saloons, and more than one prospective business partner in Denver, reading Cora Danziger's story as it was reprinted in papers across the territory, quietly reconsidered dealings with the bank that bore his name. Within 2 years, facing a slow but steady erosion of confidence among depositors who no longer trusted quite so readily in his soft-spoken assurances, Vandermeer sold his controlling interest in the Sable Creek Bank to a consortium of Denver investors and left the territory altogether, and the town, in time, came to speak of him less as the man who had built its bank than as the man whose greed had very nearly cost it a legacy 20 years in the making. Eli used the recovered gold, together with donations that began arriving from townsfolk moved by the story of Whitfield's forgotten generosity, to begin the very school Reverend Whitfield had envisioned 20 years before, built on the 40 acres of unclaimed land and using, for its foundation and its walls, the same patient stonemasonry Thomas Bishop had taught his son, so that the schoolhouse that rose through the spring and summer of 1881 stood as literally as figuratively upon the values both Reverend Whitfield and Eli's father had shared. Eli rebuilt the chapel's roof as well, not as a place of worship exclusively but as a meeting hall for the town, a place where Cora Danziger's newspaper held its town forums and where, in later years, the college Whitfield had once dreamed of would hold its very first classes before a proper building could be raised. Old Pruitt Coyle came out of a brief retirement to set the school's cornerstone alongside Eli, his weathered hand still sure despite the years, and Gideon Marsh, no longer afraid to be seen at the chapel now that the whole town watched its rebuilding with open pride, returned as well, eager to learn from Eli the same patient trade his own father had once feared to let him practice. Cora Danziger wrote of the school's opening day in the spring of 1882 with an unashamed sentimentality unusual for her column, describing the sight of nearly 40 children filing through doors built from stone Eli Bishop had cut himself, beneath a small brass plaque, paid for by public subscription, that read simply, "In memory of the Reverend Amos Whitfield, who believed a town's true wealth was never buried in the ground." He kept none of the fund for himself beyond what the town, in gratitude and in recognition of the tools and reputation he had lost to Vandermeer's scheme, voted to grant him as fair payment for the mason's work of rebuilding both chapel and school, a modest sum, but one Eli accepted with the same quiet dignity his mother had taught him, understanding that having enough, honestly earned, was itself a kind of wealth Vandermeer, for all his soft-handed fortune, had never learned to possess. We began this story with a broken man buying, for $9, a chapel that the whole town of Sable Creek had written off as worthless, a purchase so foolish that men laughed behind their hands to see it made. We told you then that something sealed behind that chapel's old stone altar would change one ruined man's fortune and restore to an entire community what it had believed lost forever, and now you understand what that something was, not merely gold, though there was gold enough, but a promise made 20 years before by a dying minister to a town he loved, a promise that only a mason's son, raised on the conviction that a wall built true outlasts the man who cut it, could have been trusted to keep. Eli Bishop lost everything a cruel and calculating man could take from him, his workshop, his tools, his father's good name dragged briefly through the mud of foreclosure, and yet the one thing Horace Vandermeer could never take, because he had never understood its value in the first place, was the quiet integrity Eli's parents had built into him stone by patient stone, the same integrity that let him recognize, in a seam no wider than a hair, a door that a lesser man would have plastered over without a second glance. What Reverend Whitfield hid was never truly lost. It was only waiting, as such things often are, for the one person capable of finding it not merely with sharp eyes but with an honest heart. Thank you for spending this quiet hour with us and with the story of Eli Bishop, a man who was told that nobody wanted his old chapel, and who found, in the wreckage everyone else had abandoned, a legacy strong enough to outlast them all. If this story moved you, we would be grateful if you shared it with someone who might need reminding that value is not always where the world expects to find it, and that the things we overlook are sometimes the very things worth saving. Before you go, we would love to know, what is a time in your own life when you found real worth in something everyone else had written off? Tell us in the comments below, we read every one. Until next time, stay close.